The sun was high over the bustling town when Chester made his move, his intentions as clear as the summer sky. He looked at Jane with a mixture of determination and earnest simplicity, his voice steady as he told her that he was taking her home. Jane blinked in utter confusion, demanding to know what for, to which Chester replied with absolute honesty that he wanted her to cook for him and take care of him. Jane stared at him, asking if he was mad, but Chester merely shrugged, admitting he thought she was simply bored. He reminded her that her mother had always wanted a big wedding, but if she insisted on being stubborn, he would have to call her Willie Lowe. Miss Jane could only sigh, telling him that she was awful sorry he had gotten the wrong notion. She explained gently that she did not have marriage in mind, and that it was just cooking and such domestic matters that needed attention. "Oh," Chester muttered, finally seeing the light as the truth began to dawn on him. Meanwhile, back at the homestead, the situation in the kitchen had grown rather desperate. Granny had not yet returned from her trip to Petticoat Junction, leaving young Ellie trying her absolute best to take her place at the stove. To anyone watching, the attempt was nothing short of pitiful. When asked how Uncle Jed was managing with this culinary crisis, the response was telling. Jed had not been seen much since Ellie commanded the cooking, proving that if he had his secret hiding places to avoid the kitchen experiments, others had theirs as well. Out in the yard, Jed was busy trying to look occupied, murmuring that he was just getting rid of a few of these ants here. He did not say no to a little help, and when the task was finished, he proudly declared that he had done a good job. He certainly did, and as a reward, Ellie happily promised to give him a double helping of what she had just cut. Jed swallowed hard, his appetite instantly vanishing. He quickly tried to back out, telling Ellie that he did not think he was up to eating a full meal right now. He suggested, with a hopeful smile, that she might just heat him up a can of that fine tomato soup that was sitting right there in the cupboard. Ellie, however, was not so easily swayed, beaming as she told him that she had fixed a special treat that she might have all by herself, a dish she proudly called her surprise loaf. Jed groaned inwardly, desperately trying to think of an escape route. "Oh, Ellie," he suddenly exclaimed, pretending that he had just thought of something important. He asked her to guess who was going to be awful hurt if he ate without him, hoping to use Jethro as an excuse. He offered to go find the boy, but Ellie quickly dashed his hopes, reminding him that Jethro was not even there because he had taken the truck and left. Jed was surprised, asking when he had done that, and Ellie replied that she believed it was right after she told him she was going to cook her surprise loaf. Jed nodded knowingly, muttering that it was more than likely the reason the boy fled. Over at the telephone station, the operator was working hard to establish a connection. The word was passed that Granny was currently staying at the Shady Rest Hotel in Petticoat Junction, but the nearest phone available to reach her was at Sam Drucker's store in Hooterville. After a few confirmations and expressions of gratitude, the plan was set to get a message to Granny so she would come to town and call back. It did not take long before Granny arrived at the store, greeted warmly by Sam Drucker, who asked how on earth she had gotten there so fast. Granny, huffing a bit but full of pride, answered that she ran the entire way, noting that it was only 6 miles. Sam was astonished and asked why she did not just catch the train, to which Granny triumphantly replied that she did catch it, and in fact, she passed it on foot. Sam turned to his assistant, Sarah, telling her that Granny was here now and asking her to get a hold of that Beverly Hills operator so they could have her call them back. While waiting, Sam asked Granny how Betty Jo's baby was doing. Granny smiled broadly, saying the baby was just fine and dandy now. Sam picked up on her tone, asking if something had been wrong. Granny looked at him seriously, stating that what she had done for that baby was nothing short of a miracle, a true medical miracle. When Sam pressed for details about what was wrong and what she had done, Granny shook her head, saying she was sorry, but she could not tell him. She explained that doing so would be violating the absolute confidence between the patient and the doctor. She wished she could tell him, but being a physician, her lips were sealed. Sam nodded, saying he understood, but Granny could not help adding that it was one doozy of a miracle. She hinted that if Sam were another doctor, she could easily tell him, asking if he had ever been a doctor. When Sam said no, she asked if he had ever been a patient. Sam affirmed that he had, which was all the loophole Granny needed. She gleefully declared that in that case, she would not be violating the confidence between the doctor and the patient. She confessed that in all her 60 years of doctoring, she had never been so shook up as she was the first time she peeked into that crib and saw Betty Jo's baby, claiming it looked for all the world like an Airedale puppy. She exclaimed that Jake was alive, and she had always thought Chester was an ugly baby. Sam was skeptical, asking if she truly meant it looked like a puppy, and Granny insisted it was true, and not even the pick of the litter. She boasted that she had brought it back to normal with her miracle medicine. Sam, remembering something, pointed out that Granny had left her spectacles in Andy Partner's jitney, suggesting that her vision might be the real mystery. Granny scoffed, asking if he thought she needed them, bragging that she had eyes like a hawk and only used spectacles for professional reasons because people simply do not trust a young-looking doctor. Just then, the telephone began to ring loudly. Sam guessed it was the call from Beverly Hills, but when Granny picked up the line, she became confused, asking who was talking. Sam clarified that it was him, Sam Drucker, but Granny argued that it could not be him because Sam Drucker was standing right there with her. Sam realized his other phone was ringing and rushed to answer it, finally getting the line sorted out with Sarah's help. He handed the proper receiver to Granny, telling her it was indeed her call from Beverly Hills. Granny, still annoyed, told him to take the phone and tell that smart aleck on the other end that it was against the law to play pranks on doctors and firemen. Sam took the phone and heard a familiar voice. It was Jethro on the line, calling out for Granny. Sam told Jethro to speak up because they had a bad connection, but then he had to yell at a stray dog in the store, saying he had strict orders not to let the animal loose, reminding it that last time it went through a whole sack of dog biscuits. Once the line cleared up, Jethro spoke to Sam, who then passed the phone back to Granny, introducing the caller as a proud father. Sam asked Jethro if the items they ordered for the baby had arrived, and Jethro confirmed they were in the back. When asked about Betty Jo, Jethro said she was fine but the baby had a bad night, howling from 3 in the morning until dawn. Granny nodded wisely, muttering that the little thing had reverted and that it must have been a full moon last night. Jethro then pleaded with Granny, telling her she had to come home and cook for them because they needed her something desperate. Granny, however, refused, saying they did not need her as desperately as the people where she was, claiming that cooks were a dime a dozen, but a miracle-working doctor for a blighted baby was truly rare. Back at the estate, Jethro was walking with Miss Jane, watching a little baby crawl incredibly fast. He remarked that the little boomer might be homely, but it was the fastest crawler he had ever seen. Miss Jane smiled, telling Jethro that she believed she had the perfect solution to their household food problem. She led him to a building, explaining that it was an employment agency where one could hire maids, cooks, and all sorts of domestic help. Jethro was overjoyed, telling Miss Jane that she had truly saved his life and asking how he could ever thank her. Miss Jane, feeling poetic, quoted a rhyme about how with hugs and kisses, debts are paid, and when settling scores, one must fix man and maid. Jethro, thrilled by the idea, proclaimed that he would be absolutely sure to hire a pretty one. A short time later, Jethro arrived back at the house, shouting for Uncle Jed. Jed was sitting comfortably, enjoying what he called real soul food. Jethro burst into the kitchen, bursting with excitement, telling his uncle that he had a massive surprise. Jed, looking a bit tired, replied that he did not think he could stand another surprise today. Jethro told him to wait until he saw her, and Jed questioned who she was. Jethro explained that Miss Jane had sent him to an employment agency, and he had successfully hired an imported cook direct from Italy. Jed was intrigued and told the boy to fetch her in. Jethro proudly noted that she did not speak much English, but that he had already learned Italian that very day. Jed was skeptical, asking if he learned it all today, and Jethro reminded him that he had the brain of a 6th grader, which made it easy. Jethro called out to the kitchen in what he believed was genuine Italian, shouting for the Bambina to bring herself to the kitchen, adding proudly to Jed that Bambina was Italian for kitchen. He boasted about how he could pick up 4 languages just like that. When the young lady walked in, Jed admitted she was a mighty pretty girl, asking if she could really cook. Jethro assured him that victuals were all she thought about. He greeted her with a loud howdy, and she responded with a polite ciao. Jethro pointed out that she had mentioned ciao at least a dozen times today already. He then introduced her, calling her Senior Maria, and told her that this was his uncle Jed. Jed offered a warm howdy, and Maria smiled, saying ciao once again. Maria then spoke at length in her native tongue, expressing that it would be a pleasure to work for them as a cook and hoping that they would like her food. Jed looked at Jethro, asking what she had just said. Jethro admitted he was not too sure, confessing he did not understand Italian as well as he talked it. Jed turned back to the guest, telling her they were mighty pleased to have her here. Maria replied with a gracious grazie, remarking that everything was beautiful. Jed smiled, thinking her words were a name, but Jethro corrected him, saying that was probably something she was going to cook for them. Just then, Ellie walked in, and Jed called her over to meet the young lady. Introduction was made, and Ellie gave a friendly howdy, receiving another ciao in return. Ellie observed that the girl truly did have victuals on her mind, and Jethro eagerly agreed that she was going to cook them up a storm. This made Ellie a bit defensive, and she asked what was wrong with her own cooking. Jethro looked at Jed, asking if he should tell her, but Jed intervened, saying it was better if he handled it. Jed turned to Ellie, reassuring her that her cooking was in a class by itself and that nobody could touch it, which was the absolute truth. However, he explained that this young lady was brand new to their country and simply needed all the experience she could get. Ellie softened up, saying that was fine and offering to learn the girl how to make her famous surprise loaf. Jed shuddered slightly, remembering his past experience, and suggested that he believed he had a whole loaf on that first attempt. He then told Ellie to take the young lady up to her room and make her comfortable. Ellie agreed happily, calling Maria to follow her, shouting that they would see the men later for ciao. Maria repeated the word, and after they left, Jed asked Jethro why he had done that. Jethro explained that it meant something in Italian, and though he did not know what, they all seemed to do it. Jed nodded, and Jethro offered to tote her suitcases up to the room, wondering to himself what he had just said in his newly acquired language. Meanwhile, back at the young couple's home, Steve returned with supplies, greeting his wife warmly. He showed her the new nursing bottles and asked how the baby was doing. Betty Jo sighed with relief, saying the little one was sleeping, thank goodness. Steve looked over at their dog, warning his wife that he wouldn't hold him because he thought the animal had fleas again. Betty Jo remembered that they still had some of that insect repellent that Granny had brewed up, the mixture she proudly called her miracle medicine. Steve smiled, suggesting they give Granny's cure another try, and went to take care of the dog. A moment later, Granny herself walked in, greeting the little mama. Betty Jo welcomed her, and Granny mentioned she had heard they had a very bad night. Betty Jo confirmed it, saying she thought it was colic. Granny blinked, asking if she had said colic or collie. When Betty Jo clarified it was colic, Granny seemed relieved. She then asked if Steve had gotten home with the little fellow yet, and Betty Jo said yes, wondering if Granny hadn't been with him on the train. Granny explained that she had cut through the woods instead to look for some roots and herbs because she needed to brew up another batch of her miracle medicine. Betty Jo told her there was still some left and that Steve had just gone in to use it on the little flea trap. Betty Jo immediately scolded herself gently, telling Granny not to call that precious little darling a flea trap, though she admitted she called him all kinds of things because she truly loved the little mutt. Granny sat down, praising the young people for having the courage to face the truth, noting that in her day, people would have kept such an unusual sight upstairs in a room with the shades drawn tightly. Betty Jo protested, saying she would never do that because she thought he was adorable. Granny smiled, remarking that there was nothing mightier than the power of mother love. She then asked Betty Jo to sit down, wanting to talk about her family plan. She inquired if Betty Jo and Steve had thought about having any more children, and Betty Jo enthusiastically answered yes, saying they wanted a large family. Granny was shocked, asking if they still wanted that in spite of what had happened last night. Betty Jo insisted that one cannot expect a baby to be absolutely perfect, but Granny countered that they did not have to miss the mark by that much. Betty Jo explained that the way she and Steve felt, they wanted to have a dozen more just like the first one. Granny warned her that courage was one thing, but foolishness was another. Betty Jo conceded with a laugh, admitting a dozen was an exaggeration, but said they wanted at least 4 or 5. Granny nodded approvingly, telling her she was now heading in the right direction. Just then, Steve walked back into the room with a freshly cleaned pet, announcing that someone was ready for a stroll. Granny beamed, asking if her miracle medicine had worked, and Steve enthusiastically confirmed that it had, telling Granny she had done it again. Suddenly, a knock came at the door, and a messenger arrived, announcing that a telegram had just come for Granny. Granny was surprised to see Sam Drucker there, asking how he had gotten there so fast, and Sam explained he had pumped out all the way on a handcar. He urged Granny that they needed to pump right back in. When asked what the matter was, Sam revealed the contents of the message, stating that her family was apparently starving back home. Granny panicked, giving quick instructions to keep an eye on the baby, warning that if it barks, they should give it a bottle, promising that she would be back by the next full moon. After she rushed out, Steve and Betty Jo looked at each other in complete bewilderment, Steve admitting he did not understand a single word of what she was talking about. Betty Jo agreed but smiled, noting that one had to admit there had not been a single dull moment since Granny came to visit. Steve laughed, suggesting that someday they ought to visit her home planet, before waving goodbye to the girls. Back in the corporate offices, the atmosphere was much more tense. The chief banker was furious, shouting at his assistant that she could put that silly-looking hat back on her head because she was officially fired. The assistant was shocked, asking what for, and the chief roared that it was for leaving her desk during her lunch break. She tried to explain that she was simply having lunch, but the chief declared that was absolutely no excuse. He complained that it was a fine thing for her to gorge herself while his largest depositor was supposedly starving. He mentioned the name Jed, calling him a magnificent multimillionaire, and warned that if that man lost so much as 1 single ounce, the assistant would spend 30 days locked in the vault counting nickels, with the lights turned completely out. The assistant tried to interject, but the chief continued to rant about how he had to handle this entire emergency all along. When asked what emergency he was referring to, the chief explained that Granny had called the office, stating that they had to get home from Hooterville right away. He asked the assistant if she even knew where Hooterville was, and when she said no, he claimed that neither did anyone else. He bragged that he had to move heaven and earth just to arrange transportation for that little woman, listing that she had been traveling by handcar, horseback, motorcycle, and even a crop-dusting plane out of the valley just to get back to Beverly Hills. The assistant was stunned by the list of vehicles, and the chief suddenly realized the financial implications. He asked the assistant if she had any idea what these elaborate travel arrangements were going to cost, and when she replied that she did not, he snapped that she would find out soon enough because the entire amount was going to come right out of her salary. The assistant pointed out that he had just fired her, so the chief quickly changed his mind, telling her she was hired again because he certainly could not afford a tab like that himself. The assistant shook her head, telling the chief that he had brought this entire situation upon himself by panicking, assuring him that there was absolutely no emergency at the homestead. The chief demanded to know what she was babbling about, reminding her that Granny explicitly said they were starving. The assistant explained it was all a false alarm, revealing that she had sent Jethro to an employment agency, and he had successfully hired a professional cook who was working at the house right at this very moment. The chief froze, the horror of the situation sinking in. He asked if she meant to say that Granny was going to come home only to find another woman operating in her kitchen. The assistant hesitated, and the chief, reaching his breaking point, shouted that she was fired once again, declaring that he was going right over there himself to fire the new cook. The assistant asked how she was supposed to pay for the travel expenses if she was fired, and the chief yelled back that it would simply come right out of her unemployment check. Back at the mansion, dinner was a massive success. Jed wiped his mouth, declaring that those were just about the best victuals he had ever tasted in his life. Ellie agreed wholeheartedly, and Jethro smiled proudly, saying he was going to compliment the cook in her native language. He turned to Maria, calling her Bambina and telling her that the meal was what you call a delicious success, adding for his family's benefit that it was Italian for good. Maria smiled gracefully, excusing herself to bring out the next course, which she introduced as a special sweet traditional treat. Jed and Ellie looked at each other, confused by the foreign words, and Jed asked what she was saying. Jethro confidently explained that she was saying something about a friend of hers named Tony. Jed turned to Ellie, telling her that if she could cook like that, she would have to beat the boys off with a club. Ellie told her father not now, expressing that she was highly motivated to ask the young lady to learn her how to make that incredible vegetable soup, describing the stringy stuff with the red gravy as right tasty. Jethro laughed at them, calling them a couple of hicks, explaining that the soup was what you call mine strong, and that the stringy stuff was what us Italians call spaghetti. Jed looked at him blankly, asking if he was suddenly Italian now. Jethro admitted that he had told the cook he was, confessing that he fully aimed to marry her, because in Italian culture, it was just the proper thing to do. Suddenly, the chief banker burst through the door, determined to put an end to the employment arrangement. He marched up to Maria, telling the young lady to pack her things and get over to his house instead, having tasted a sample of her cooking. Maria looked confused, asking in Italian for him to wait because she did not understand. The chief, trying his best, asked if she was Italian, and when she confirmed it, he broke into delighted broken Italian, welcoming her and proclaiming his deep love for Italian food. He began listing his favorite dishes, mentioning chicken cacciatore and praising how beautiful everything was. He thanked her profusely, calling her very amiable, and expressed his great pleasure at the prospect of her cooking for him, specifically requesting spaghetti with marinara sauce. He thanked her again, completely forgetting his original mission to fire her. Jed watched the interaction, pointing at the dish and asking if that was red gravy on it. Jethro corrected him immediately, telling him that it was not red gravy at all, explaining with absolute confidence that the delicious red coating was what you call marijuana sauce, completely misunderstanding the word marinara. Jethro then turned to the chief, declaring that he's going to marry up with that Italian doll anyway, and asked the chief if he wanted to come live with them. The chief, amused, asked where Jethro aimed to live, and Jethro gestured around the grand room, saying they would live right here, inviting everyone to join in. At that exact moment, the front door flew open and Granny burst into the house, looking exhausted but ready for battle. She was carrying a massive bundle of canvas, and Ellie asked in shock what all that material was. Granny panted that it was her parachute from the plane ride. She ordered them to tote her straight to the kitchen and prop her up next to the stove so she could save them, calling them a bunch of hungry, starved wretches. Jed looked at her in surprise, telling her that they were not hungry at all, explaining that they had been living high on the spaghetti ever since she left. Granny stopped in her tracks, demanding to know what on earth they had sent her that urgent telegram for, claiming that it said they were all starving to death. Jed shook his head, stating firmly that he did not send her any telegram. Jethro swallowed hard, stepping forward to confess. He admitted that he had sent it, Granny, explaining that he had signed Uncle Jed's name to it just so she would pay attention and come home. Granny stared at him, her face turning red with anger. She called him a miserable walking gizzard, shouting that she was going to beat that 6th-grade brain of his clean down to the kindergarten level. Jethro panicked, running behind the chief banker for protection, crying out to Maria that the angry woman was now coming for Tony. Jed just smiled, trying to keep the peace, and suggested that they have Tony sit right there in Jethro's place at the table, noting cheerfully that Jethro would not be sitting down to eat for quite a while anyway since he was going to be doing all his eating standing up from now on. The laughter filled the room as the misunderstanding was finally cleared up, bringing the family back together in perfect harmony. With the chaos settled and hearts full of joy, it was finally time to say goodbye to Jed and all his kin, who wanted to thank all the folks for kindly dropping in, extending a warm invitation to everyone to return next week to this exact locality to have a heaping helping of their famous hospitality, being the true hillbillies that they were, satisfied and happy, reminding everyone to take their shoes off and come back anytime.